Hi everyone, thank you very much for stopping by and returning to the old world today. Bit of a novelty, I'm going to be commenting directly on a video produced by another content creator. I'm looking at Midwinter Mini's video on everything wrong with historical wargaming. I know there's a few videos out there already on this topic, but thought I do have some comments to add from what I've already seen. So, let's have a look. So before I go into anything critical, I do want to pick up on the fact that Midwinter Minis does make some points to which I definitely agree. He talks about some of the positives of historical wargaming, such as the affordability of the models, which is definitely a plus point. They do tend to be cheaper than Games Workshop models. There's the reason why my fantasy armies, where they've been human-based, have used historical miniatures, because although they're a little bit smaller, that doesn't matter so much, but they're also quite a bit cheap. He also comments about the quality of the rule sets that are out there, and absolutely there's some really good rule sets that have some really inspired ways of thinking, and we can actually see elements from other rule sets from historical wargaming when we look at Games Workshop games. Really, things like command points have been around for a while, and I've seen them in other gaming systems as well. Not sure exactly which came first. It might be a bit chicken and egg, but there's definitely a lot of good things out there that systems borrow from each other. So that being said, let's talk about the other stuff in the video. So quite early on, there's some comments around effectively playing the bad guys in historical wargaming, and he attributes a comment to one of his staff about not wanting to paint a Panzer IV because it's a Wehrmacht vehicle, and the Wehrmacht are connected to a regime that's pretty unsavoury. And there's some talk around, well, if you do historical wargaming, someone has to play them. Fundamentally, though, I don't think that's true. Depends what you're playing in your historical wargaming. And for this moment, let's just focus on World War II. A World War II game does not have to be Axis versus Allies, and if you go to a tournament, this is a bolt action video, so I'll talk in the terms of bolt action. If you go to a bolt action tournament with your Allied force, let's say you're taking a unit of the Desert Rats from the British Army, you might be paired up against Italians, you might be paired up against the Japanese or the Wehrmacht, but you could equally be playing US Marines. You could equally be fighting a Soviet naval brigade. It's not always going to be fighting against an Axis power. So I don't think it's true that someone has to play them. And the same is true across all wargaming, is you don't necessarily have to have historical opponents on the field at the same time. You can do it the way you want to. But of course, if you want to play a historic campaign or a historic battle, recreate something that actually happened or something very close to it, then yeah, absolutely, you're going to have certain armies facing off against each other. There's also some comments within this around it can feel a little bit offensive, or the word they used, I believe, was ucky, or romanticising the bad guys. So I did a video a little while ago about whether wargaming glamorizes war. And I don't think that it does. I don't think it has this element of romanticism to it that people believe it does. Why? Well, yes, we are talking about maybe particularly heroic actions, and didn't they do well? Weren't they so brave? But education comes to the core of this, and I think a lot of historical wargamers, the vast majority, in my experience of historical wargamers, take an interest in the field they're representing on the tabletop, and they use it as an opportunity to learn in a fun way about what was going on. A really good example of how people are aware of the wider connotations and issues around wargaming certain events, I think actually comes out quite recently. So shortly after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, I went to a wargame show, I think it was Hammerhead, And I noted that whilst it is generally historical, for the first time in quite a while, there was very little Team Yankee on the shelves. Why is that? Well, Team Yankee, it's the Cold War goes hot in Europe, and perhaps that particular conflict breaking out was a bit close to home. People recognised that it wasn't on the game tables, it wasn't on the shelves for people to buy. So there is that recognition that war is bad. Real people get hurt, and you see this in campaigns where you have to worry about attrition and not having your people wiped out and fighting to the last, as you might in a pickup game. So there's a lot, I think, around the education side of wargaming that means we can move away from a view that we're just romanticising conflict. What else is there in this video? Well, there's a throwaway comment by one of the Midwinter mini teams around historical miniatures being easy to paint because they're mostly drab camouflage. Yes, I think that is very much true if you're looking at conflict in the last 100 years or so. But it's not something that you can ascribe to historical wargaming generally. You need to be more specific. You need to say, this is true of World War II. This is true of Cold War. This is true of World War One. Certainly later World War One. There was still some colour at the start. But you can't say this is true of historical wargaming. Just look at the Napoleonics. There's all kinds of colours going on, even if you only collect one army. Let's say you take a British army. You're going to have guys in red, guys in blue, guys in green, lots of different colour variation, and then you've got all the facings of the infantry is all different for all the different regiments if you're going in a big enough scale to pick that out. So I think it's a bit of a sweeping statement to say historical wargaming is easy to paint because it's drab. It's not. It's a riot of colour, medieval knights, loads of different heraldry. And let's face it, uniforms in a sort of a modern sense hadn't been seen in this country from the Roman times until really the New Model Army was established towards the end of the English Civil War. Before then, colonels dressed their regiments how they wanted to, so you can have all your regiments painted in different colour combinations depending on the whim of the person that raised/commanded that particular unit. Moving on, there's some comments around historical wargaming not being as popular as Warhammer. Now, I'm not sure if this is true or not. There's an awful lot of people that do historical wargaming. I think the difference is rather that whereas in fantasy/sci-fi you have Games Workshop produced material, which is by far and away the market leader. In historical wargaming, there is so much choice. There are so many periods you can play. There's so many scales you can play. There are so many rule sets out there, and it seems there's new rule sets coming out pretty much every month, that there isn't that one rule set to run them all. Now, I hear really good things about bolt action. I've never played it. I'm not massively into the smaller skirmishy sort of games so much like that. But people that do like that game, a lot of them play bolt action. Great, go for it. But you've got, for World War II, more rule sets that you can shake a fist at depending on whether you want to do a corps level game, a divisional level game, a brigade level game, squad level games. There's so many rule sets out there for people to choose from that I don't think it's possible for one gaming system to really take ownership of a period in the same way that Games Workshop has of his sci-fi and fantasy gaming. The video goes on to talk about why people might choose to play, let's say, the Wehrmacht, and talks around maybe people are into the engineering, maybe people just want to chase the meta and they want the best kit. And there is a bit of a reference here around some people might play the Wehrmacht because, or other elements of the German military because they ascribe the same views as the political leadership. Now, there will be one or two people that do that, absolutely, but I don't think that's true of the majority of people. And I think it's perhaps an oversimplification as well to talk about people just wanting the best kit. Now, for individual rule sets, yes, it may well be that if you take elements of the German army, their stuff is better. Historically speaking, though, I think there is definitely some strong challenge to that. So if you look at the invasion of France in 1940, were the German tanks better than the French tanks? Actually, no, they weren't. What was better was the German command and control. Their use of radios was really helpful, whereas the French tanks largely didn't have them, and they were used in a way that wasn't as effective as the German tanks. Does that make the German tanks better? No. What about the later war? Well, yes, the Germans had some really, really great bits of kit. Tiger tank leaping out. Tiger tank, very heavily engineered, over-engineered, some might say. It's also absolutely huge. So whilst it's very powerful, it can take on Shermans quite easily. It was very vulnerable to air attack because it was hard to conceal. And I remember hearing a thing about a Tiger tank was capable of defeating 10 Shermans. The problem was the Allies always had an 11th. So a well-pointed rule system will mean that a Tiger tank doesn't necessarily have huge advantages, because an Allied army using Shermans would be able to put enough numbers on the table in order to eventually counter it. Final point I want to talk about is a comment that maybe historical wargaming struggles a little bit because on sites like YouTube, there's a greater risk of demonetization if you talk about certain ideologies in your videos, and that you're more likely to do so with historical wargaming. And that's a problem for people that are relying on their YouTube monies as their primary source of income. What I would say to that is actually I think there's a lot of historical YouTube channels out there that cover quite a range of things. Now, I don't know if these are professional YouTubers, whether it's just people doing it in their spare time. But if you look at things like Little Wars TV, for example, they cover a whole host of content. They do some really interesting videos. It's clearly that they're able to do so without feeling particular pressure to avoid historical wargaming. And actually, I would definitely recommend their videos on the Alamo, for example, which was quite an interesting game setup they did with a custom set of rules in there. Pyrrhic campaign against Rome. Some really interesting stuff. So for me, historical wargaming can't be tarred with the same brush that everything is World War II. There's so much more out there. And there's so much we can learn from historical wargaming, whether it's because it encourages you to research the wider period in which you're representing on the tabletop, or whether it's simply because it gives you another perspective. I'll close with an example I think I've used before, but when looking at maps of deployment at Waterloo, I never really fully comprehended, I think, from the maps, from the descriptions, why Wellington deployed the cavalry the way he did. And then I saw a game in, I think it was 10mm, representing Waterloo, which had a historical deployment. And you look at that and you just go, oh yeah, I see it now. By having a different way of representing the visuals, it brings a greater degree of clarity. And I think that's why we see war game tables. Effectively, that's what they are in museums, showing what battles looked like so that you can see it in a different way and draw a different perspective to gain the information that you need. So there we are. That's it from me. I think, as I say, the video I'm talking about, there's a few sweeping statements here that perhaps could be tidied up. There's a lot more nuance involved that needs to be considered. But overall, yeah, that's where I stand. So I will be returning to my normal videos around fantasy with a bit of 40k thrown in. If you've enjoyed this video, however, do let me know and I can look to make some more videos commenting on historical wargaming. All that remains for me to say is thank you very much for listening this far. I am returned to the old world. Have a great day.